remotely Dr. Ariel Goldstein, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Cognitive and Brain Sciences at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Ariel uses cognitive computational models to try to understand high-level cognition. More specifically, he's interested in constraining computational models of cognition by brain data. And today he's going to talk to us about using deep modeling to better understand the brain. Hopefully we can hear you. If not, then blame it on UCL, not me. Right, so you can start now.
Okay. So thank you very much. I hope you can hear me, and if not, it's not that important. So I'm going to try to cover three endeavors that my lab is working on. One is using large language models to model the brain. Second is large language model interpretability. And third is interaction. And when I talk about interaction, I'm talking about interaction between human to human, human machine, and machine machine. I'm going to start about describing my work on brain modeling. And I think that the big question is can we use large language model to model the human brain? And to try to answer this question, I'm going to address four sections. One, what are large language models? Second, the neural data and the data structure that I'm working with. The encoding analysis, which is the basic analysis I'm doing in several works, and the results. So what is a large language model? A large language model is a feed-forward neural net. It's a function that learns to map input to output. In the case of a large language model, it's an autoregressive model where the input is a sequence of words taken from a corpus, and then the output is the next word in the sequence. So the way that these models are being trained is by downloading, scraping huge amount of corpora, and then training the model to predict the next word of a sequence. So how do we do it? So we take words, we feed it to a neural net. How do we feed words into a neural net? We represent each of them as a vector. Vector is just an array of numbers. Then the neural net is doing a sequence of nonlinear transformations, which are basically weighted averages with some nonlinearity on top. And then from the last layer, the model makes a prediction regarding the next word. And then given the actual next word, the model fine-tunes or optimizes its transformations to make a better prediction for the next time. Importantly, from the last layer, induces a predictive contextual embedding, which is also a vector, also an array of words, which is contextual because it represents the word given its context, given its past context, and it is predictive because this is the task the model is trying to do. The neural data I'm working with is ECOG. ECOG is a signal we collect from patients at the hospital. These are patients with severe epilepsy, that in order that the treatment requires them to go into a first surgery where they open the skull and put electrodes on the brain, waiting for seizures to locate the focus of the seizure. And then in the second experiment, they remove the focus. In this period of time, we can do experiments with the patients if they volunteer. I'm going to describe two data sets. One, the 24/7 data set, where we take free recordings of all the conversations in the room. And the second is a podcast experiment where we give the patients to hear in a 30-minute auditory podcast. The data structure is as follows. So we have electrodes, okay? So we have the neural signal collected from the electrodes. Then we have the auditory signal, whether it is the podcast or the recording of the conversation. Then we have a transcription of the audio, aligned with, of course, with the audio and aligned with the brain. And we can say for each word, whether it is part of the comprehension where the patient listens or production where the patient speaks. And then we can represent each word as a vector. Now, this vector can be static vector, which we call embedding, a representation of a word using a vector we call embedding. A static representation such as glove is a representation that captures the semantics of the word, regardless of its context. So each word gets a single vector. We can take a contextual representation. In this case, each word gets a different, such as the one I just showed, where each word gets a different representation as a function of its function, or it could be something multimodal, which I will describe later. The analysis I'm going to use is encoding. In encoding, what we do is we, for each electrode separately and for each time point, relative to the onset of the words, we are trying to predict the neural signal from the embeddings. Okay, so we split the data, 90% of the words and their neural signal in the training set, and 10% of the words and their neural signal at the test set. We learned a linear model that relative to the word onset, where we just start to hear the word, we learn the linear model that learns to predict the neural signal. And then in the test set, we use the model that we learned in the training set. We predict the signal, and we correlate it with the actual signal. So we get a measure of how well we are able to predict the signal. Okay, so how will encoding analysis we look? We can see it here. So we have this a time on the x-axis and correlation, how well we were able to predict the signal, and what happens before the onset is basically predictive processes. So we took the neural signal for the podcast data, and we ran it for multiple electrodes. What we can see here is that we achieve very high correlations at the superior temporal gyrus, which is auditory area, and at the IFG, inferior frontal gyrus, which is Broca area, associated with a semantic representation. So using the embeddings induced by, sorry, I didn't say, using the embeddings induced by the GPT, in this case, LLM named GPT-2, the contextual embeddings achieved relatively high correlation with the brain in the areas where we expected. Now, if we look at the temporal dynamic and we average all the temporal dynamics, which of course reduces the correlation, we can see some very interesting things. First of all, we can see that the contextual embeddings induced by the LLM are higher for all the time points than the static representation, okay? Suggesting that there is some similarity between the representation induced by the model and the neural response of the brain and the representation of the brain. Second, we can see that before word onset, I don't see if you see my cursor, before word onset, we have a significant correlations, suggesting the brain has semantic information about words it did not hear yet, which is prediction. Now, I remind you that we didn't tell the patients to make a predictions. The brain automatically, implicitly is making these next word predictions, showing another similarity between the large language model, which is solely a next word predicted machine, and the brain, that it seems that it makes these predictions spontaneously. Okay, so we see these two relations between the representation of the brain and the model, and between the task of doing next word prediction. But what about the predictions themselves? Okay, so to explore the predictions themselves, we look at the places where the model, the large language model, made an incorrect prediction. So in this case, our story begins deep in the rainforest, but the model predicted ocean. Okay, so we took the static embedding of the word ocean, the word that was not heard or said in the podcast, and we used it to predict the brain, and in fact we got significant and positive correlation before word onset that peaks at onset. Of course, once at onset we start to hear the actual word and the correlation is going down, but this suggests that the brain had a similar prediction as the model, even though it was not the correct one. Okay? When we compare it to the actual word, we can see that prior to word onset, the correlations were lower, but still significant, but lower. Okay, so we can see a relation between the predictions themselves made by the model and the ones made by the brain. And now we wanted to ask ourselves, what about the process of generating the prediction? So I remind you that it is just a feed forward a neural net. So we can take an embedding so far what we did is we took the contextual embedding from the last layer, but now we can take the embedding from each of the layers separately. So we repeated the analysis, taking the embedding from each of the layers. Okay, and what we are interested is the temporal dynamic. We wanted to see if there is a relation between the encoding, between the layer that from which we took the embedding and the when we get the correlation with the brain. And indeed, what we got is that the deeper the layer is from which we take the embedding, the later we get the peak correlation. Okay, suggesting that there is some similarity between the process that's happened over time in our brain and over the layers in the model. We are now also working on releasing this data set. So other people with other ideas about the dynamic of the temporal processing in the brain can test against this benchmark. We did a preliminary analysis where we took this classical psycholinguistic hierarchy of phonemes, morphemes, syntax, and semantics, and you can see it here. The correlations are lower, and they don't seem to follow any temporal dynamic. But this dataset will be released. Okay, so next, we thought about the following question. The brain doesn't get words. It gets acoustic signal, and it needs to decipher the semantics from it. So we took, and we wanted to see if we can use this a deep learning approach to model the entire process, or to start earlier. So what we did, we took a model, which is multimodal. This model is Whisper. The name is Whisper. The input for the model is the actual audio, okay? And then it is being run through the layers of the neural net. And in the end, it starts to make predictions regarding the words inside this audio and making next word predictions. Now, importantly or interestingly, we can think about it as two blocks. One that is closer to the audio, and in the end, we can think about the embedding induced by the last layer as a speech embedding, which is closer to the acoustic features. And in the other embedding, we have this semantic embedding, which is, by the way, this stack is trained exactly as a large language model, making the next word prediction, but it is constrained also on the speech embedding. So we have speech embedding and semantic embeddings from this model. So we use these embeddings on the 24/7 dataset, unconstrained speech in the hospital. And I want to draw your attention to two interesting facts. First of all, we can see that what we call semantic areas, such as Broca, are more correlated with the semantic embeddings, and that auditory and motor area are more correlated with a speech embedding. However, and this is very interesting, also in the semantic areas, such as the IFG, we do see a bias toward the semantic representation, but there is also definitely significant correlation with the speech embedding, and vice versa. The auditory areas do show preference or bias toward the speech embedding, but they do also have a significant correlation with the semantic representation, which casts doubt on this, if you believe the way I was taught, this like street hierarchy of representation. There is a bias in the high order areas, and there is a bias in the low order areas, but there is still, the representation is actually fused. This can also give us an opportunity to look at the temporal dynamic. So when we look at the production, when the patient speaks, we can see first we have temporally, we have first correlation, significant correlation with the semantic representation, then the motor representation, and then also with the primary auditory cortex. So we can see here the planning procedure from the semantic to the motor to the planning of what we are about to hear when we generate the speech, and it flips when we explore the comprehension. We can see that first we have peak correlation with the auditory, and only then in the semantic areas. Okay, so the next step was, of course, to dive into this language production process, which is not explored enough. And we discussed what happened about listening, so we know that the brain is making predictions similar to the predictions that the model is doing, which is basically the statistics of the world. But what happens during production? One might think that we already know, the brain already knows what it is going to say, and it now needs to translate it. So basically, we would not expect to see a difference between probable words. Probable means that the model was able to predict, than improbable words. But we got exactly the opposite. We got that improbable words got their they had peak correlation prior to word onset and higher than probable words, suggesting that there is some effort in making these a production of improbable words. We can see this effort also in the reaction time, because we can see it takes longer to articulate them. Another insight that we have regarding production is that we can see that the brain plans ahead more than one word, actually up to 4 words in our data set. Okay, so I think that we can use large language models to model the brain or aspects of it, which makes large language model very interesting to me. So I have another line of research where we are trying to understand them and see what they can teach us about cognition, or what they can offer us as new perspectives on old cognitive questions. This research is led by a master student, Yuval Shalev, and there we take a look at the phenomena called in-context learning. In-context learning, we take trained large language models. These are models that are already trained, and we teach them by giving them examples. Okay, so here there are examples for a task of doing arithmetic. Here there is some switching words, switching letters, and translation. And then in the end, we give them as part of the input the target that we want to implement the task on. And we can see that the models are able to learn from the task, from the input. Now, why is it, to me, was very surprising? Because these models are not trained anymore. They are not training anymore. Their weights are fixed, okay? And I think both in machine learning community and in the neuroscience community, the terms of learning and plasticity are almost synonyms. But here we can see learning without plasticity. So we wanted to see if we can test it the way that we test human learning, and we took a very famous paradigm of statistical learning. In this paradigm, you induce some arbitrary language. You define an automaton, and then you can transverse through this graph and generate valid sequences. So this is like the words in your new language, and some invalid sequences. And we know that humans are able to learn this type of structure from the examples. Okay, so we fed it to the model, and we can indeed see that once we feed it series of valid sequences, the model was able to learn what letter of the word should come next. Okay, so it was able to learn this arbitrary, artificial, never seen before examples, and to extract the regularities. We also did some rigorous testings taking from the psychology literature about testing it, and the model was able to perform it. Okay, I will, for the sake of time, because I have 1.5 minutes, but this is a super cool experiment, but I will skip on. I will just say for a few words. We wanted to see the process of how the model learns to generate the predictions, and we saw that there is this like hierarchy of the model first learn to predict the most common word, the most predictable words, and then it articulate the next most probable word. But I will not get into it. But it's very exciting, and it can give us suggestions as to what the brain might do. I want to say one word about interaction, because it goes so well with Professor Ivanova Rogers' talk. We gave students to so here we started with just with humans, but I will skip this also. we gave medical students a test and gave them like real test questions that we come up with, but they were difficult questions, and we let them interact with a chatbot that we designed, and we saw improvement, like a big improvement in their performance. And now when we are analyzing where the performance is coming from, the improvement of performance, we see the importance of two factors that were mentioned by the previous talk. First, of metacognition, people are aware of their own confidence and have a way to estimate well how well the suggestion made by the model is feasible or not. So we are now tackling deciphering this, disentangling these notions of confidence and metacognition in the ability to better interact with models. And I will not get into this. I want to thank my amazing group who did all the heavy lifting. And I want to say thank you. I'm only 30 seconds after the 20 minutes.
Right. Let's take questions if we have. Okay. Things magically seems to be working now, so maybe this will work. Oh gosh, I'm sorry about that. I did do that before, but for some reason, okay, I should. Same. No, maybe that one. Yeah. Okay. Let's try with that. Okay, here we go. We can try with that.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Great. Yeah, really interesting talk. So you're looking at correlations between how LLMs work in the human brain, right?
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on whether you can use this sort of analysis to detect whether LLM systems might be conscious? And I'm totally aware that some people think this is a ridiculous question. And some people think, LLMs, yeah, of course they're not. They run on digital machines. Of course they're not consciousness. But I'm really intrigued to, for example, I've got no idea. I've really got no idea whether they might be or not. I suspect they're probably not yet, but, I really don't know. I'd just be really intrigued to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So my PhD was about consciousness and unconscious processes, and my initial interest in GPT-2 was the way I thought about it is a great model for unconscious processes because it's automatic, it's associative, it's everything that I was thought of as an unconscious machine functionally. I'm talking about functionally. I mean, the way we thought about the unconscious was some system that is associative, and I was very intrigued by it because I saw, okay, some associative system can do very interesting stuff. So this is my personal history, and I don't know if my intuition, because it's just an intuition, if these are the machines are conscious or not. I mean, it goes to our intuition about what consciousness is. I can tell that if we are, and okay, I will say that I think that if you want to tackle it scientifically, this question, I think the thing is that we can tackle this question scientifically now, because there is a full field, an entire field of neurocorrelate of consciousness. There is field with the a belief that they can look at the neural signal and then decide and then say something about the consciousness of the brain, for example. And there is, for example, the work of Tononi, who developed this phi measure of taking a system, taking artificial systems also, and defining how conscious, the measure, the level of their consciousness. So if you can take the markers developed in the field of neurocorrelate of consciousness and some of them test here. So I think that there is a way to make some progress in the question using the literature of neurocorrelate of consciousness. Personally, my intuition, my gut feeling is that no, but I would put zero weight on my personal intuition. I think that if we believe enough, if we trust enough the measurements developed in the field of neurocorrelate of consciousness, we can tackle this question upfront. And this is the best I can say about it.
Thanks. Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah, Nadine, go ahead.
I have a less scary question, just a detailed question on your analysis, your neural analysis. I think this work is absolutely fascinating. It's really cool, and like the amount of detail you get is really amazing. So I had a question about your temporal dynamics analysis, where you basically, if I remember correctly, you said that the earlier layers were correlated to signals earlier in time, and then the later layers were correlated to signals later in time. But then
Yes.
just like 2 slides before that, you mentioned all about predictions, and wouldn't you expect that it would start in the opposite direction before the stimulus and then it would switch? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so I think I know what you mean. And I will tell you this. The embeddings, they are high dimensional representation. It's basically a lot of features, and they represent a lot of different types of informations. So, and I think that the key word here is think about biases. Each layer has information on each of the aspects that we are interested in modeling the language, the semantic, the phonetic, the predictive, but different layers are biased differently. Okay, so the last layer will be geared toward the next word prediction itself, because this is what you need to decode from it. But it will have information about the phonetics, the grammatics, the pragmatics, all of it. It will be biased toward some aspect, but it will have information from all the other aspects as well. The hierarchy is not strict. This was the point from the multimodal, but it goes across the board in these models. The hierarchy they induced is not strict. It's basically each model each layer is a function of the previous representations or layers. So while you will see predictive information in all of the layers, it is also, we need to see something else here also, that it might be that it is different part of the neural signal that is being predicted. I don't have it here, but I can say that the different layers code different information in the brain signal. So let's say if we take the best layer in it's intermediate layer 22 in this case, and you take the embedding from it, and you regress up the information you have in this layer, you regress it from all the other layers. Okay, so basically now you eliminated what you could predict using the best layer. You still get significant correlation, and you still get the temporal dynamic, because the different layer code different type of informations that goes beyond what each specific layer is coding. So it's more complicated than just saying this. This embedding matches the information here, and this embedding matches the information here, because each of the layers have different compounds of the different type of informations that are relevant in the brain, and they are biased towards different aspects. But it seems that these biases that the embeddings have do map to the biases that the neural dynamic have over time. I hope it was clear and not too.
I think it's not an answer to my question, but that's okay. I think we should